Napoleon ended the French Revolution with the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, not to establish peace, but rather to expand France's power worldwide. At the height of his reign in 1810, Napoleon controlled all of the Western countries in Europe, including the Netherlands, Austria, the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and modern-day Germany and Poland. His rule ended in 1814 when France was attacked on all fronts. While he tried to come back to power in 1815, he was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo the same year. He established the Napoleon Museum, which housed not only the royal collections, but also thousands of art pieces taken from the countries he had conquered. This museum was meant to show the wealth and prestige that Napoleon's conquests had brought to the country. Napoleon initiated the commemoration of his military victories in several public monuments and statues in Paris. Among these are the Vendôme column, which was made from the bronze of enemies' cannons, and the Arc de Triomphe. Unfortunately, the Vendôme column became one of the most disputed monuments of 19th century Paris due to its claim for imperial power. It was dismantled in 1871 and then reconstructed years after. Napoleon used art as a vehicle to propagandize his power, public image, and military deeds. He did this not because he particularly liked art, but because he saw the promotional power it held. Jacques-Louis David was appointed the first painter to the emperor the same year Napoleon inhabited this role in 18. David, as well as many other painters, such as Antoine Jongreau, were responsible for upholding Napoleon's image and documenting his military conquests. However, the emperor organized and dictated all of the details to be painted. In 1799, Jacques-Louis David exhibited the Sabine women at an exhibition in which patrons had to pay to view it. This was uncommon in France at the time, but did occur in Britain during the late 18th century. David was heavily criticized for this by people who believed it was wrong to put a price on viewing art. Yet it was necessary for David to charge for people to view it since he was not commissioned to paint it and had taken 5 years to complete the piece. The period known as the Directory, from 1795 to 1799, followed Robespierre's reign of terror, in which 17,000 people were guillotined. David's Sabine women was painted to be a metaphor for the healing and reconciliation occurring during this period. The Sabine women is often compared to David's Oath of the Horatii of 1784, because both paintings use Roman history to display a war between the Romans and a neighboring clan. Sabine women celebrates the feminine concerns with family, overall harmony, and peace. Napoleon rose to power the same year that David exhibited this painting, becoming emperor in 1804. Napoleon felt the need to support his image and regime using large amounts of propaganda, specifically in the form of visual art. The school of Jacques-Louis David turned out a great number of students during the Napoleon era and therefore had the greatest influence on the aesthetic landscape of the arts. David had already earned a reputation painting propagandistic scenes for the Napoleon government, such as the coronation of Napoleon, and he had quite a long teaching span, from 1781 to 1816. Regarding aesthetics, his students can be broken into 4 groups. Those who adopted David's strict neoclassical guidelines, such as Antoine Jongreau, Anne-Louise Girardet, and François Girard, all who continued the neoclassical style as well as contributed to the propagandistic painting that David had become well known for. The second group called themselves the Primitives and were not interested in sticking to the neoclassical model that David was teaching in his school, but rather preferred the aesthetics of pre-classical, medieval, and Renaissance eras. The third group of students not only had David's training, but also a plethora of plundered arts from Napoleon's regime, and as such their aesthetics became somewhat mixed over time. Yet another group of artists which came out of David's school is the aristocrats, whose style borrowed historical scenes and leaned towards muted colors and subtle tones, similar to that of the 17th century Dutch genre paintings. This style became known as the Troubadour style. Aesthetic changes became increasingly evident in the male nude, which became softer and more androgynous. This was partially due to a generation which was fed up with the executions and suffering that the Revolution had brought about, and instead opted for glorifying a male who was more sensitive. Roman scenes began to be replaced with scenes from Greek mythology, and Christian scenes became much more prevalent after a ban on organized religion was lifted. Smaller paintings, which fit well into the smaller homes of the growing middle class, signaled a major shift in the salon, which was long used to large-scale paintings. Educational narratives, such as historical or national themes, were shifted to representations of more contemporary themes, a change that surely shocked and interested the French middle class. Additionally, the genre of landscape painting reasserted itself within the arts, despite not being considered high art. Of these landscape categories, the most respected was the historical landscape, a genre which depicted historical scenes set against traditional landscape backgrounds. Although the subject matter changed, many key aesthetics continued to be drawn upon from historical images. Art continued to lean on traditional narratives, at least aesthetically. For example, Napoleon being painted in a Christ-like manner, in a crowd looking compassionate and composed, in such a way as to refer to the images of Christ healing the people. Of all the landscaped artists of this time, Pierre-Henri de Valenciennes was the most notable. He not only adopted a soft and subtle aesthetic, but as a teacher at the École des Beaux-Arts he greatly influenced the students who took to landscape painting, which helped contribute to the genre's prestige within the salon and academy. In post-16th and 17th century Spain, wealth was squandered in the futile wars in Europe. King Carlos II passed away, leaving the throne to Philippe d'Anjou, a French cousin who took the name King Philippe V. The country steadily decayed, cities became more dangerous, there was mass poverty, and no education system. The degradation continued under the reign of Fernando VI. However, Fernando was a proponent of the arts and founded the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando. Huge economic and sociological changes occurred under Carlos III, who employed massive efforts to improve education, agriculture, and generate new building projects. Carlos III invited Giovanni Tiepolo and Anton Mengs to decorate the new buildings. Tiepolo was known for his exquisite Rococo style, which was common in Spain, whereas Mengs was known for his French Baroque. Mengs was appointed first court painter after his work began to take on subtle characteristics of the Rococo style, as seen here in his painting, Portrait of Carlos III. Additionally, he was placed in charge of reforming Carlos III's Fine Arts Academy. Francisco Goya started out as an apprentice under his father at age 13. He eventually moved to Madrid and mentored under Francisco Bayeu, who aided Anton Mengs in reforming the Royal Tapestry Manufactory of Santa Barbara. Goya began designing tapestries as one of the young artists brought in to give the Royal Tapestry Manufactory a facelift. During this time, he began to experiment with images reflecting the working class, and although they were uncommon, the tapestries were supported by the royal family. Goya began to excel in portrait work and eventually court painting, which helped to develop his style. After completing the portrait of the Count of Floridablanca, Goya was officially appointed as the Pintor del Rey, or Painter of the King, in 1786. This was a position previously held by his role model and mentor, Diego Velázquez, in 1623. There are numerous parallels between Goya's portrait of the family Carlos IV and Velázquez's famous work Las Meninas. The large scale of the paintings, each ranging from 9 to 11 feet in height, establish a commanding presence. While capturing the subject matter of an intimate royal family portrait, both artists incorporate themselves into the painting, as each piece is painted from the perspective of the working artist at the easel. However, Goya separates himself from his predecessor in the formal elements of his work. Soft lines and warm light is utilized as opposed to the mirror-like sharpness of Las Meninas. Goya later turned to printmaking in hopes of gaining independence as an artist. Through the technique of etching, he created a series of prints titled Los Caprichos, or The Fancies. This series was divided into 2 albums combining social commentary and pictorial satire while dancing along the line of targeting the clergy and aristocracy. The later works focused on dark and dramatic imagery rooted in ancient folklore describing the evils in the world as a nightmare. Perhaps one of the best examples from this later series is The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. As seen here, the image shows the artist asleep at his drawing table, surrounded by a violent, dreamlike fury of bats, owls, and cats, all emerging from the dark. The caption reads, "Imagination abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters. United with her, she is the mother of the arts and the source of their wonders." Being knowledgeable about art as propaganda, Goya was commissioned by the Spanish government to create patriotic paintings. He painted 2 scenes depicting the conflict between the Spanish rebels and the French oppressors in the Spanish War of Independence. The first scene, the 2nd of May, 1808, depicts a riot that broke out in the capital city of Madrid. The citizens of Madrid rioted against the Turkish soldiers in Napoleon's French army. Prior to this painting, such harsh images had been scarce. However, they inspired other artists to show the types of raw, heartless violence that existed at the time in war-torn Europe. The second piece, The Execution of the Rebels on the 3rd of May, 1808, depicted the execution of those same rebels by the French army. It is important to note the distinction between the 2 factions in the execution. The French army is shown as automatons. They each have the exact same pose, they are dressed and lit similarly, and the viewer can only see their backs, which strips away the humanity and individuality of each man. In contrast, the rebels are well lit, each with their own unique pose, and their faces are shown to the viewer, as if to appeal to the viewer's humanity. Furthermore, the rebel being executed has his hands up in a gesture that begs for mercy. Following the restoration of Fernando VII to the Spanish throne, Goya received fewer and fewer commissions. Due to Goya's illness in 1792, he had become deaf and eventually retreated to his home called Quinta del Sordo, House of the Deaf Man. He chose to paint 14 large-scale paintings directly on the plaster in his home, with images ranging from religion, mythology, and daily life. The most notable of these images was Saturn devouring his child, seen here. In the image, a large, aged, and grotesque Saturn is depicted slowly consuming the corpse of his child. In Roman mythology, Saturn was told that one of his children would eventually dethrone him. To prevent this, Saturn decided to devour each of his children once they were born, ensuring his long reign. His son Jupiter, however, would eventually supplant him. Francisco Goya, despite being one of the 2 most prominent Spanish artists of the 19th century, was not followed by many other artists. His contemporaries admired him, but most of them chose to follow the neoclassical artists like Jacques-Louis David. We conclude our presentation by discussing the Boston Museum of Fine Arts exhibit, Goya, Order and Disorder, which was on display from October of 2014 through January 2015. In keeping with our theme of art and revolution, we note that revolution exists as a form of tension between groups vying for power, between the powerful and the powerless, and sometimes within ourselves as we struggle to make sense of our lives and our own internal conflicts. In the moment, the tension seems to demand resolution, and the result is revolution. An important part of art history is not just the chronicle of a particular artist's work, but also situating that work in terms of social history. In this regard, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts curators chose to display Goya's work as an expression of tension throughout his life and work, rather than merely topically or temporally. Showcasing over 70 of Goya's works, the exhibit was arranged in 8 major sections. The titles of the sections highlight the tensions represented therein and include themes of nurturing and abuse of children, hunting as sport and metaphor, religious devotion and superstition, equilibrium and loss of balance, justice gone awry, and the symbolism of the giant. The exhibit was intended to show connections across mediums as well as across decades, helping the viewer to see how Goya and his work fits into one's own mental map of the history of art. One key work that highlights this tension is Goya's 1797 etching titled The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. The ambiguity here is quite telling. It may mean that when we allow reason to fall asleep, the result is all forms of evil threatening to carry us away. On the other hand, revolution is always, at some level, the product of reason. One group decides that the current situation is intolerable and demands forceful action, while the other group, holding the contrary position, sees reason as being overrun by monsters of this forceful action. Another piece where we see a type of revolutionary tension is in Goya's 1777 work, Parasol. Here we have a young woman of the upper class, dressed in aristocratic fashion in a self-assured and eye-catching pose. The parasol is held by a young man of lower social class, indicated by his clothing and hairnet. The ambiguity here is in the precise relationship being implied between these two individuals, lady and servant, or surreptitious lovers. Perhaps the difference in their social classes may indicate some form of a two-person social revolution. On another somewhat playful note, the exhibit displays the tension between equilibrium and loss of balance. A significant portion of Goya's work involved bullfighting, and this 1815 etching is titled The Speed and Daring of Juanito Appignani in the Ring of Madrid. Concentrating almost entirely on the bull and the man, the spectators in ring are only partially evident. We may contrast this feat of supreme skill with his 1824 sketch Crazy Skates, where the hapless man is clearly an instant away from what today we would call an epic fail. Moving to a more disturbing duality, we see Goya's 1791-92 painting, The Straw Mannequin. Here, a group of 4 young girls torment a straw doll dressed as a French dandy. This was a carnival custom, playfully suggesting that women are able to do with men whatever they like. This playful custom, however, hides a darker notion of the strong treating the weak with cruelty. This notion is more clearly illustrated in Goya's series of etchings titled The Disasters of War. This particular image, Plate 39, is titled A Heroic Feat with Dead Men. Here we see dismembered bodies displaying all the horrors of war, where the capacity for cruelty played at the carnival is played out in war. What is of special interest is that this scene does not depict what the soldiers have done to enemy soldiers. Rather, it depicts men who are accused of being traitors and who have been killed and mutilated by townspeople. A further tension that we see in the exhibit is one between religion and superstition. Goya had a high disdain for superstition, as numerous etchings in his Caprichos show. In this image, What a Tailor Can Do, we see common people prostrating themselves before an imposing figure that has been mistaken for a monk, when in reality it is nothing more than a cloak wrapped around a tree stump. Here we see Goya attacking the power wielded by the clergy and the officials of the Inquisition. An even more powerful statement regarding superstition is Goya's 1797 painting, The Witches' Sabbath. Here we have a group of witches offering up their children in sacrifice to the devil. But we should balance these two images with the deeply moving painting titled The Last Communion of St. Joseph of Calasanz. The large painting is dominated by the priest and the kneeling saint in a moment filled with faith and trust, quite the opposite of what we see in the Capriccio etchings. Even within individual portrait works, we can often see tension and ambiguity. In his 1797 painting, Portrait of the Duchess of Alba in black, the Duchess is pointing to an inscription in the sand which says only Goya. One of the curators, Stephanie Stepanek, notes that this may be Goya's insistence that he alone could have painted such a portrait. However, her right hand bears a diamond on which Alba is cut, while the index finger has a gold ring with the name Goya. Goya spent many months with the young widow in her country estate, where he executed numerous sketches, paintings, and etchings. As such, the exact meaning of only Goya remains somewhat ambiguous. Throughout Goya's works, then, we see tension, ambiguity, and perhaps revolution. As disturbing as his disasters of war etchings are, these are not images of what Goya actually saw himself. Further, we note that these were produced between 1810 and 1820, but not published until 1863, well after Goya's death. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts exhibit serves as a fitting conclusion to our presentation. The difficult proposition of Goya's lifelong project, whether it was intended as a reflection or as reporting, as condemning or condoning, as the product of his dreaming imagination or of his nightmares, remains. We nonetheless take them for what they are, and consider whether, in life or in art, conflict and revolution are to be dismissed as imaginary, avoided because of their turmoil, or sought out for their potential for growth and progress.